Hi, this is the latest webinar from Troy Demoulet. We've been doing a whole series of webinars lately about DevOps and Lean and some of the other new practices we're seeing these days. Today's webinar is called DevOps Leadership, Moving from Experimentation to Transformation. Sounds interesting. I know Troy's got lots of thoughts on this. Can't wait to hear what he's got to say. But you know, lately we've said a lot about how there's still confusion about what DevOps is. It's a little bit different from many of the other practices we talk about, which is why George Spalding and Troy Demoulet have each done webinars on DevOps and Lean recently. And it's why we've developed some new courses. Pink's approach we want to have is very prescriptive and practical. And in the DevOps Leadership course, which Troy's going to mention, you'll hear about the Pink 2020 change model, which is brand new, and the 15 key practices and the assessment tool. So anyway, don't panic. It's time to hear from Troy Demoulet. He's here to explain about DevOps leadership, moving from experimentation to transformation. Enjoy.
And good afternoon. My name is Troy Demoulet, your host and speaker for today's webinar. I'm the Vice President of Research and Development at Pink Elephant, and today's webinar topic is DevOps leadership, moving from experimentation to transformation. I'm quite excited to actually be sharing with you the webinar today because this is a sneak peek into an exciting product that we're bringing to the market. The industry is, of course, full of discussion around DevOps and what does that mean and how to practically adopt the practices and automation of really a necessary practice and set of automation elements to bring an organization closer to meeting business objectives in a speed and velocity-oriented way. But the key question is, how do you move that dial? And we'll come back to that statement in a few minutes, from experimentation to full transformation. And that's what the DevOps leadership class is really intended to focus on. And this webinar is kind of giving you a view into some of the key topics that we'll be discussing in that class. So our agenda for today is that I'm going to be just talking a bit about the transformation, or the steps towards transformation most organizations will go through, and how to manage that concept. Also be introducing to you something that Pink Elephant first introduced in its DevOps Foundation course, which is the DevOps full stack, which is a metaphor meaning the big picture, right? The full picture. Systems thinking is a big part of DevOps concepts. In this new course, we're going to be introducing you to the 2020 change model. It's an integrated change approach, looking at how do we use the change management practices that we're very familiar with in an integrated way to best adopt DevOps practices and to move us from experimentation to transformation. The DevOps Essentials class talked about 15 practices. We're going to go deeper on the leadership side, and specifically how do you lead an organization around the implementation of those specific practices. And then I'll touch briefly on the DevOps assessment, which is an awesome and interesting tool that we've introduced at Pink Elephant to help organizations plan and to evaluate where they currently are in order to make the necessary steps for governance and management of their overall transformation projects. So that's our conversation today. That's the agenda. So join me as we kind of walk through what is the DevOps leadership class. So I've made this comment a couple of times. Experimentation to transformation. A lot of organizations out there that I'm speaking to, that I work with on a regular basis, are all moving around DevOps concepts. They're experimenting, they're piloting, they're prototyping. They're using Agile and Lean and bringing in other methodologies such as ITIL, change, release. Those things all have to be brought together in some way to focus this high velocity, highly collaborative approach to moving value into production, going from requirements to value as quickly as possible by attaining, not just speed, but also the quality, quality at the source. And also, of course, there's an element of cost reduction because we're removing variability and waste from the system. But it's really, for the most part, in my experience, still very, very much an experiment most organizations are playing. And the question is, how do we move it from this experimentation concept, moving that dial to full organizational transformation? And what does that even mean, by the way? So that's where we're going to start our conversation this morning, understanding the difference here. First of all, before we get into that, I want to talk about the context of the full stack. because, as I mentioned earlier, it's a model that we introduced in the Foundations course, but it really is a metaphor describing the big picture. A lot of the concepts in DevOps, come from systems thinking as written by Peter Senge in the Fifth Discipline. And the reality is that there are some critical dependencies to achieve this DevOps transformation. And if you leave one of these transformational elements out of the equation, then your successful adoption of DevOps in general is in question. Transformation is totally in question. So many people, of course, like to focus on the tools first, and we'll get back to the tools. They're definitely a part of the DevOps conversation. But remember where DevOps began. It was this challenge around collaboration. We had devs on one side, we had ops on another, we had the wall of confusion, throwing things over the fence, whatever you want to call it. But the reality is, even the concept of DevOps as one word is a concept where we need to bring together this organization to move from a silo-based thinking concept to this more systems view, product-oriented, value chain premise. But you don't get there from there when you have a tribal-based, silo-based culture. So how do we bring more of a national, we the people versus me, myself, and my own tribe conversation? It all begins with creating this systems thinking conversation at a cultural level. And so if we can't help people to understand they're not just links in a chain, that they actually are part of a chain, and that if we're going to eventually automate this chain, value chain, we're going to have to actually get people to act, believe, and consider they're part of an integrated whole. And of course, that's where DevOps brings in the conversation of cross-functional teams, something Lean first evolved in the problem-solving space and Agile developed on for literally development purposes, and now the DevOps team representing a greater membership of that team, but having not just a membership from different elements of the value chain, but also how it needs to be led. And a key part of what we'll talk about in the leadership class is how do you lead cross-functional teams, not just assemble them. All of this comes back to culture. Now, the reality is that when we have a group that understands it isn't a chain, a value chain, then they can understand that they share common practices. And so, for the organization to take demand and produce supply, there's a number of different elements that happen, whether we're using Scrum type practices, whether we're looking at this from a voice of customer conversation, allowing us to do backlog grooming, whether we're thinking about testing and validation in the context of a sprint, whether we're moving into production in the context of deploy and release. All of these practices are the key elements we're actually collaborating on, right? Continuous integration. We have to know what the practices are before we can actually consider how to automate them. So this is why we think about the full stack, right? You have to have the full picture because it's hard to win a game when you're only playing with 1/3 of the deck. Now, my personal experience in the DevOps world, though, is whenever I'm working with clients and they're calling, quote unquote, what they're doing DevOps, what they're doing is creating a pipeline. Obviously, that's the sexy bit. That's the part we like to play with, the tools, the toys, the automation. But remember that the automation is kind of the end point. You've got to have the culture and the practices in place before you automate. And this full stack is incredibly important to understand when we're considering a transformation concept. So I've actually developed 5 questions to consider when thinking through DevOps and thinking through the full stack as we see it here on the screen. So the questions go like this. The first question is, can we agree to agree to agree? And that might sound silly, but this is around getting away from this silo-based, I'm a link versus a chain conversation, right? Can we agree that we're in one collective integrated whole? Second question, can we agree on one way to do something? We have so much variability out there. Every team creating truth as they see it, having 5 ways of doing anything around code management or asset management, whatever practice you care to think about. And of course, 5 tools to do that with, but that'll be something I come back to in a minute. So can we agree on one way? That's the second question. Third question, it's fine we have one way, but can we agree on simplifying that one way? Because before we automate this thing, we want to actually think about removing waste, removing variability, reducing technical debt, right? We need a way to simplify, remove the waste. That's the third question. Now, the fourth question finally gets to the tool conversation. We're working our way up from the bottom of the stack here. Can we agree on one tool if possible. I know that's not always possible, but having one way to manage code and artifact management, is probably better than having multiple ways if we want to manage trunk, right, and shared continuous integration approaches. But here's the next point. This pipeline we're developing, right, it's not just a continuous integration tool, but we have to go into automated build and then automated testing and then automated deployment and then automated release to customer. In essence, we're creating this integrated, literally, pipeline of solutions where the input of the downstream tool is the output of the upstream. So we're conveying this code through a conveyor belt concept from beginning to end. Well, you can't really do that when you have a point solution or best of breed mindset. So the fifth question here is, can we agree on an integrated solution over best of breed? Because that's the way we get pipelines. Now, those three questions to start with were all organizational change and practice questions. Only the last two questions were tool questions, because you have really to think about this full stack as, first of all, a full stack, but we have to think about it from the bottom up. So the transformation conversation is definitely dependent on understanding this full stack. And in the foundation course, of course, we focus on that, and we focus on the critical 15 practices at the middle layer, and that how that actually then supports the automation of the pipeline. Now, I mentioned this whole concept of experimentation from my perspective is what's happening in most organizations. How do we move from experimentation to transformation? This model that I'm about to show you was first introduced to Pink at one of our events. For several years now, we've done this Pink think tank where we invite various subject matter experts from various parts of the world together to talk about, major issues and interesting questions. The first time I was introduced to this concept was at one of those think tanks, and it was via Rob England, so thank you. Shout out to Rob England, the IT skeptic, that he first described this, and then we incorporated this into one of the outputs of a white paper from that think tank. And so he talks about the adoption or implementation or transformation, depending on what word you like to use, of DevOps around some key phases. So the first phase is like this. So you've got somebody out there, some brave soul in the organization that gets the vision for DevOps, and that could be a manager or team leader, and so they begin to become an evangelist, and they have this small group of people around them, and they eventually influence these folks and bring them on a journey. And so this one person becomes the spark, if you will, in the organization, and now I start to see a group doing something they're calling DevOps. And that's awesome. That's a starting place, right? It's the initiation experimentation. Eventually, others get a hold of what's happening. In fact, a lot of the folks that were in that first group, which have now all seen the light, begin to also generate other teams around them. In Agile, we call this split and seed, right? Taking a group of folks that have moved through an adoption curve and using the energy, the belief, the excitement of those folks to then put yeast in other groups, if you will, which again brings a greater momentum to the attraction of the concept as well as the adoption of the principle. But here's what's happening in my experience. All these groups, as they begin to evolve around DevOps principles, are really doing so in pockets and isolated ways. We're getting more energy in the market, in the organization specifically, but we don't have a lot of common approaches. Various people are trying different things, which in its own right is not a problem, but we get a lot of variability. At this point, in my experience, what also happens is you get organizations which are creating digital pipelines by product group. And that can be a problem because that actually creates more complexity, variability, and technical debt. Where we're trying to move towards is more of a platform as a service, shared service, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Right? So we get the various groups moving into wider adoption. Eventually what happens is we go for what is called, Gartner would consider the bimodal. We put together a cross-functional team, and we put on that cross-functional team a member of each of the tribes, if you will, into one product or product line, service line type of group, where within that group you have skill sets that manage the full life cycle from engage to run. And so this is bigger than an agile team because it's not just plan build, but we also have people involved in this DevOps team from a cross-functional perspective, also from an operations perspective, or non-functional requirements like security or architecture. And so we have within this now product group a total self-contained galaxy for product line. And that allows us to get exciting things doing. First of all, the group begins to develop its own affinity and its own identity. The walls come down because we build relationship now between this group. And if we're managing and leading them right, they're getting much more involved in their work because they're self-managed and autonomous. Right? So that's all good. So this now cross-functional team, this bimodal function, is operating in a completely different way. Now that can be very well done and be useful as a pilot, or I've also seen it go very badly, where the cross-functional group actually spins out of the organization because this mode A is the traditional way of doing things. Mode B is this new accelerated high-velocity cross-functional way. Now if mode B becomes its own entity with its own culture and begins spinning off and basically segmenting away from the traditional organization, you can have huge cultural impact. It's literally like you have, the favored child and the unfavored child, and one's getting all the love, and you're saying, why can't you be like your brother, right? So that can be very badly done. However, if I create this cross-functional team as a proof of concept, as a prototype, and I literally leverage it as a way to show the rest of the organization what is possible, and even let people from mode A go on safari and go into that group and then come back again into their other organization. What we're again doing is splitting and seeding. We're literally kind of doing a blood transfusion, and we're not separating these two modes. We're basically taking more and more of the organization into mode B through this prototype and evolutionary concept. So this is still on the way to transformation, but we're not quite there yet. So what we need now is to go from experimentation to this total transformation model. So AKA, what is leadership? Leadership is, I have a group of people over here at point A, and I have to get them somewhere they're not over there to point B. And I have to lead them that way. And so I have to cross this chasm, if you will, from the current state to the future state. Now, how do you do that? How do you go from experimentation to full transformation? And also, ideally, creating constancy of purpose, that's a key lean principle, right, around how this is being done. So I'm getting the leverage of getting the common ways of doing things, moving to a shared platform as a service, as opposed to each group doing their own thing. That's going to take leadership. That's going to take change, literally change management. Because what I'm going for now is to create this experimentation concept to where the majority, if not the entire part of my organization, is now moving in these directions. So this is where the 2020 change model comes through. Because now we have to consider, how do we actually lead an organization from, yes, the prototypes are working, they're cool, it's making sense, but now I need to do a transformation to the total side of the equation. And speaking of equations, I'd like to introduce you to this conversation here. So one of the things that we talk about in the change model is that change is really an equation. This is a model called the change model by Gleicher. And it's a mathematical equation in its presentation, but it's all about human beings. And so this is how it works. For any organization to fully, basically, accept and embrace change, these factors have to be true. First of all, you have to dissatisfy them with their current state. You have to show them why the current state isn't going to be something that is tenable in the future. Of course, we've got all this external pressure, speed to market, digital disruption through digital transformation. We've got unicorns out there getting into traditional business models, and basically it's a horse race, right? But, just getting dissatisfied isn't enough. I have to get a sense of what does good look like, right? This vision of the future state. And this is the travel brochure, if you will. What does that Emerald City look like from the point of view of a DevOps transformed organization? Well, we've got some of that messaging already going on because we've done the prototyping. We have these bimodal, so it's visible to the organization. But then how do I take the rest of the organization through a series of steps, right? And so now I have to give you the first steps. This is the roadmap. So the important thing here is that I have to have all three factors. My D and my V and my F. They all have to be true or greater than 0 for it to be greater than the cost and risk of change, right? So that resistance is going to have effort. I have cost, even if it's perceived as a valuable thing, it's going to be costly, both in time and effort, and also there's politics fighting against it, right? So I have to be able to get all three of those factors, my dissatisfaction, my vision, my first steps in place. We do that through an integrated change model. All of the models that are available to us, whether we're talking planned change like Cotter or emergent change like Senge, we're talking about DMAIC, which walks us through, the defining and the measure of the current state, which helps us with the dissatisfaction aspect because I'm truly understanding the impact of current state before I analyze and improve. We're looking at the fact that while Lean talks about leading with questions, right, the Socratic method, I also have to realize that my skill set and my ability to lead my team will have to change based on where the team is, based on their skill and their current position relative to their energy. So we talk about situational leadership. All of these models in the 2020 model we bring together to talk about how do we take an organization through this concept of unfreezing the current state. Yes, we've been successful at these pilots, but how do we now unfreeze the rest of the organization so that they're ready, because they're dissatisfied with the current state and they see the beauty of the future, to transform, right? To make that leap now into more universal adoption. Now, it's one thing to get us, across the chasm, which that's the transformation stage, but then how do I stabilize this? How do I sustain it? How do I ensure that we can continuous improvement? Because we're constantly moving this along. So we need sustaining structures, like you see these arches in place, where we not only assemble cross-functional teams, but we have changed our leadership style to lead cross-functional teams. Because this changes. What does a manager do, today versus tomorrow, where today they direct the work of their team and tomorrow they're facilitating the development and the enablement of cross-functional teams? There's totally different changes in this. In fact, one of the things we'll be talking about is how to lead cross-functional teams. So speaking of that, this is kind of giving you a taste. So we're definitely going to be revisiting the 15 practices from the foundation course, but we're going much deeper than that here. We're looking at those 5 questions, but before we look at the 5 questions, we're coming down to that bottom layer, the cultural layer, right? There's stakeholder management. We have to very carefully understand who are the key players and how to manage those stakeholders effectively in engaging them in the change, leading the change. There's communication. A lot of what we're going to be talking about is building a Kaizen mindset or a spirit of continuous improvement. How do leaders engage their population? And it's not just a single answer because there's different people at different places in this journey, but engagement strategies around their stakeholders to have optimum leverage for this. How do I lead innovation? It's one thing to lead a steady state. It's one thing to lead a maintenance or run type organization, but we're focusing now on moving more of our energy to an innovation, going places we've never been before. So how do you lead an innovation-based team? These are key things we're going to be describing in the leadership course. Now, those practices, we mentioned the 15, we still have to think about those, such as value stream mapping, using visual management like Kanban boards, or, Agile. We're going to talk about Agile again, but in this course, we're going to talk about how do we scale Agile. And so, Agile itself is focused on teams, but small teams. How do you take the small team and plug that small team into a bigger thing, a greater purpose? Whether we're talking about scaled Agile, whether we're talking about strategic conversation around portfolio, these are all key components we're going to actually bring into this practice discussion. So taking the 15 practices and accelerating them kind of to a more leadership level. The 5 questions I've already kind of gone through with you before, but there's also an interesting discussion around branching we're going to be introducing as new conversation. So the 2 camps out there, continuous integration or branching strategies. We'll be getting into the pros and cons and having great discussions around when this makes sense and when it doesn't. So stay tuned for more on this. But there's also the concept of how do we evolve this pipeline? Do I go from point solution to full pipeline in one step? Or are there typical evolutionary stages of evolving this total integrated system of automation? So these are key conversations we're going to be having in the leadership class. All of this, though, I want to point out, comes back to this: how do we plug in to achieve business objectives? And that's kind of where the scaling conversation takes us as well. Because DevOps in its own right is not its own purpose or its own objective. It is being adopted and ideally transforming organizations to achieve business objectives, and this will be a key focus on this course, the major element of this course, in fact. How do you align DevOps to biz DevOps, if you will, in this conversation? The last thing I'll mention before we close off our webinar today is remember that this whole structure of this course is around the change model we talked about. But at various points in the change model, where we're talking about freeze, transform, and stabilize, sustain, we're going to be leveraging assessment that Pink Elephant has developed for the DevOps courses we have. And so we'll be leveraging this because, again, part of governance is basically evaluate, direct, and monitor. But to evaluate, you have to know where you are. Okay, so you do have a target state. This is that nirvana, that emerald city that we talked about. But to get to that target state, you have to have a valid look at where you currently are today, your current state, and understand the gaps, because understanding those gaps and prioritizing those gaps in your evaluate step will allow you to direct the highest priority work and then monitor your progress over time. So this assessment tool that we're leveraging in these courses is a critical success factor for your transformation journey. Well, you can tell I'm quite excited about it because I'm part of the development of this course and I have a huge affinity for leadership topics. So, the DevOps leadership course is the most recent course that we're introducing to our stable or portfolio of products. There's a lot of courses out there for those of you who want to take a deeper dive into these subjects, right? So we have, of course, organizational change, which is a big part of this. Lean is this big part of DevOps. Integrated service management, the conversation of how does it all fit together, right? So, and don't forget, we have Agile courses, and for those of you who would like to visit and join us at our events, I'm very excited about the leadership event we have in August this year. And of course, we cannot forget our signature event in Las Vegas, Pink 19. Those of you who would like more information, please feel free to sign up for my Pink portal. And that's just free resources available to you around many of these topics. So join us. This is an invitation. Join us in this exciting journey as we take a look at how do we move from experimentation to transformation? How do we move the dial to total adoption and get done what we need to get done to stop talking about DevOps, but begin practicing it?